Welcome to Train Signal. You're watching how to make your boss mad and then turn around and fix it really fast. And this one is subtitled Setting Up Your Organizational Units for Better Group Policy Implementation, Security Filtering for GPOs Using Groups, and Making Your Boss Happy Again, of course. So let's go ahead and let's talk about what it is that we're going to be looking at here. In this video, we're going to start off by kind of covering what we're going to be building in a diagram format. Of course, we have to talk about why Hank is angry. And then we're going to do a little reorganization work so that everything that we need to get done can be done. So let's go ahead and let's start off talking about what we're building. In our last episode, this is what we built. It was fairly basic. We have one main New York organizational unit. As we know, we have 25 user accounts. We have linked our desktop lockdown group policy so that it affects all of our users currently. Well, that may be a problem. Jamie had also set up all of our machines and added all of our computers to the organizational unit, NY computers, and of course we have a couple of groups scattered around. Don't forget about the administrator account. Now, after our video today, this is what it's going to look like, okay? We're going to have a whole lot more stuff broken out in here. We're going to stick with our standard New York OU. We're going to be creating a new group called IT users. Our desktop lockdown is going to continue to be linked to NY users, but we're going to be separating out and creating a new OU called sales. We're going to be putting our sales users in there and our sales groups in that new sales OU. We're going to do pretty much the same thing with ops. No big surprise there. We're going to break out ops into their own separate OU as well as have our two ops groups in the mix too. All right, so that's what our network is going to look like. So really what we're going to be building out. And we're going to be doing some work with the executives group and the IT users group as well in terms of how desktop lockdown affects users in those two groups. All right, so let's go ahead and jump in here. We have a problem though. Right now, Hank is really mad and he can't put a picture of his favorite horse on his desktop, and he's threatening to fire you if you don't get that fixed really quick. So here's the deal. You need to make sure that Hank's user account is exempted from the desktop lockdown policy that we just, did all that work to set up. Now, this is not an uncommon situation. A lot of, especially in a small business, if the boss does not like a particular restriction, well, you have to figure out how to take it off. You just don't get a choice. So also your assistant Jamie, who is a fairly experienced IT technician, hey, Jamie doesn't like being locked down either, so we also need to make sure that Jamie's account is exempted from this as well. So, sometimes we just have to do a little bit of reorganization. Now, we know that group policy objects are applied at the OU level, but we may need to separate out some users and or some computers into separate OUs so we can apply different group policy objects to different organizational units. GlobalMantic's OU structure right now is really basic, so we do have some options. One thing we can do is we can separate out our users into separate OUs and apply different group policy objects to each individual organizational unit. We can also separate our users into separate OUs, and we can use a technique called block inheritance. Now, block inheritance is sometimes useful, sometimes not. I mean, there's a lot of different variables that might go into block inheritance. We'll talk about a couple of them and a drawback of using block inheritance for this. But we can actually block inheritance for a particular policy for an OU. And we can also use another technique called security filtering. And we can exempt particular user accounts or entire user groups. Now, here's the thing. We were creating groups earlier in this video series, but we were talking about how groups are primarily used to grant permissions to resources. Things like shared folders, shared printers, and all that. We tackled all that. But here's the thing. When you have groups, we can also use groups in conjunction with group policy and actually filter out a particular group of users so this particular policy doesn't affect them. All right, let's talk about each one of these in a little bit more detail. Here's option one we just talked about. We can basically break out our OUs into child OUs, and we can link separate group policy objects to each individual organizational unit. So inside of NY users, we can have one for sales users, we can have one for ops users, we can have one for the executives group that, of course, right now only Hank is part of. So we could put Hank and the executives group into this executives OU. Now, this is not a bad idea because we can create separate group policy objects for each individual organizational unit that is appropriate for each one of these particular departments. So there's a lot of advantages to breaking out our users into separate OUs. Now, this is not exactly the fastest fix, though, for our particular problem, because remember, Hank wants you to fix it fast. And creating separate OUs and creating separate GPOs, well, that's going to take a little bit of time, right? Let's talk about our separate option. Again, we're still going to be breaking out our sales users and ops users and executives into separate GPOs, or I'm sorry, separate organizational units. And we can still apply desktop lockdown to the New York users. Now, here's the thing. By applying and linking this desktop lockdown to NY users, it's also going to apply to all the users in sales users because remember that whole folder inheritance thing we were talking about? Yeah, it works here in group policy too and in OUs. We can actually allow sales users and all the users in this OU to inherit the settings from desktop lockdown without having to directly link it to desktop lockdown. We can link it here once, and then it just kind of filters down to the rest of the organizational units. Now, we can use another technique called blocking inheritance. Okay? Now, when we block inheritance for, let's say, in this instance, the executives where Hank Richardson's account is going to go live, then all users in this particular OU would not get settings from desktop lockdown. And that's really what we want to happen, right? So this technique would initially work. However, there is one drawback to this. Let me tell you what this is. There's a setting on the link, okay, where we can actually say that this desktop lockdown is enforced. Now, if this particular link or this particular policy is enforced, it actually breaks through that block inheritance, okay? So let's say that Jamie, without knowing it, or maybe you yourself aren't thinking about it, you decide to enforce this desktop lockdown policy. And by the way, when you enforce desktop lockdown, any other conflicting policies are going to be overridden by this one. So when you enforce a GPO, you might end up breaking through some of those block inheritance items. And I'm going to show you all that, by the way, coming up when we actually finish our discussion about this and actually go over to the machine to solve it. So this is not a perfect solution, okay? Now, it is an initial solution as long as we're not enforcing desktop lockdown. That's going to be fine. But if we do, as soon as we do that, it breaks through that block inheritance. So you need to kind of keep that in the back of your mind. Most of your group policy objects are not going to be enforced specifically for that reason. You're only going to enforce a group policy that is absolutely vital to your enterprise, okay? All right, so let's talk about our third option now. Now, our third option is when our user account groups that we were building start to come into play. We can use a technique called security filtering that will actually allow us to exempt certain user accounts and or groups, and most of the time we'll apply it to groups, from having a particular group policy object applied to them. So we can still go ahead and use desktop lockdown and link it to our NY users. And this is going to apply to all the groups that we allow it to be applied to. It gives us a pretty fair amount of control. But then we can say, okay, you know what? Let's say we're going to create an IT users group, because remember, Jamie's not being very happy about having the lockdown too, right? Because Jamie's an experienced IT professional, and we don't want to restrict folks who we're going to have to trust. So we're going to have to trust that Jamie is not going to do anything weird on his computer. So we're going to create a group for Jamie, and we can use that security filtering to make sure that the desktop lockdown policy does not apply to that particular group that Jamie's account lives in. And we can do the exact same thing for the executives group that Hank is in. Now, this particular technique does not require us to break out our users into separate organizational units, okay? If we only have one policy that's causing a problem, this might be a good solution. I don't think it's a very good long-term solution. I don't think it's a good solution that's going to allow you to expand and to grow and to change policies easier as your requirements change, because they will change. Just so you know, once you set up a network, your work is not done. because things are going to change about your network and what people are going to have access to and all kinds of other policy issues that come about. Now, the nice thing about this is that even if a policy is enforced, if we use the security filtering with our groups that we created, the group policy still does not apply to them. Okay? So this is a significant advantage. And again, when you're working in a small-scale network, this is not a bad solution. All right, so what we're going to be doing, though, in order to fix our stuff, is we're going to be using a combination of techniques. Okay? We're still going to use desktop lockdown for all of our users, and it's going to apply to all of the users in NY users. But again, we're going to be breaking out sales users, ops users, and the executives into 3 separate organizational units, because we still want to create an organizational unit structure that's going to be expandable and it's going to make sense for us in the future. But we're going to do that whole security filtering technique to make sure that when we create our IT users group, which we're going to have to do, right, because it doesn't exist yet, we're going to apply a deny, read, and apply group policy for the desktop lockdown. We're going to do the exact same thing for the executives group, even though they're in a separate OU. Because here's the thing, if you are using your security filtering, it does not matter where executives groups necessarily lives at. We could actually leave them over here in NY users if we so desired, and that would be okay. If Hank's account and the executives group is hanging out over here in the NY users, we can go ahead and use that security filtering to still make sure that Hank can put his favorite picture of his horse on his desktop as his wallpaper, and that's going to be okay. If we start moving groups around, though, we might end up with some problems. We might have to go back and reapply security filtering. All right, so, and again, if there's anyone else in the executives OU that is not part of the executives group, well, they will still get this desktop lockdown policy by default. Now, if we have, let's say, a vice president comes aboard and we put that vice president in the executives group, well, in that case, that desktop lockdown policy will not apply to that new vice president. All right, so this is what we're going to be doing. And once again, just a quick review before we bounce on over to DC1 to actually make all this happen. We're going to be breaking out 3 new organizational units inside of NY users. So these are going to be child domains, right? We're going to be creating an IT users group. We're going to be putting Jamie Owens into our IT users group so we can use that whole security filtering technique to make sure that Jamie isn't locked down either. Then after we have the IT users group and Jamie in it, then we're going to go ahead and use that security filtering on both groups. And then, of course, we will have to test it out, right? So we'll test out our organization techniques. So enough talky-talky, let's do the walk, huh? Let's go over to DC1 and let's make this happen. All right, so here we are back over on Client 1 where we are still remote desktoped into DC1. And so what we're going to be doing here in the server managers in Active Directory users and computers, here in the New York OU, we have our NY users, and this is where we're going to be creating our new organizational units. So in order to create a new organizational unit for NY users, I right-click on NY users, go to New, and go to Organizational Unit. First one I'm going to create, we'll do Sales first here. And you'll notice that Protect Container from Accidental Deletion is checkmarked. That's a really good idea. We'll tell it OK. All right, so Sales is created. Let's go ahead and let's make Ops here real quick. We'll right-click again on NY Users and go to Organizational Unit, and we'll make one for Ops. Let's make sure it's capitalized. There we go. And now let's do one more for Executives. Okay, so we'll go ahead and do this here real quick. Again, not a difficult process to create new OUs, right? Uh-oh, what's going on here? Windows cannot create the object Executives because an attempt was made to add an object to a directory with a name that's already in use. Oh, that's right. Remember we created that executives group earlier? Yeah, it's not going to work. So we're going to have to make a slight change. We'll just call it executives OU. Okay, there we go. All right, so now in NY users, we now have 3 new organizational units. We also need another group, right? Let's go ahead and scroll down here because right now our groups, we have sales users, sales managers, ops users, ops managers, and executives. So we need a new group for our IT users, right, for Jamie. So I'm going to right-click again on NY users, go to New, and go to Group. And I'm going to call this IT users. And again, I'm leaving the defaults out alone as they are and telling it OK. All right, so now I have IT users. Let's go ahead and put Jamie in that group real quick. Right-clicking on J. Owens, which is, by the way, Jamie's account. And just in case you don't believe me, I'll double-click on it here, Jamie Owens. Okay, great. Thanks, Coach. Right-clicking on J. Owens, adding it to a group, and then I'm just going to type IT and check the name. Hey, there it is, IT users. Tell it OK. Hey, the added group operation was successfully completed. That's fantastic. I'm going to tell it OK. And so now we have the arduous task of moving stuff around, okay? Now, initially, we can just start clicking and dragging stuff. It's not going to hurt anything. I'm going to take executives and drop it into the executives OU. It's going to holler at me and say, hey, you know what? You start moving stuff around, you might end up having some problems, and that might be the case. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to tell it yes anyway because we have to move them, right? We really don't have a lot of choice in this matter. So now the executives group is in the executives OU. I'm going to stretch this guy out here a little bit. There we go. Go back to NY users and let's go find Hank's account. Here we go. Here's Hank. We'll move Hank over here into the executives OU and tell it yes. Now, right now, I bet you're thinking, why didn't we do this ahead of time? And yes, we should have done this ahead of time. But ahead of time, we really didn't know as much about group policy as we do now, right? So now you see that we're going to have to start doing a lot more work when we start having to move stuff around. And, you know, the next thing is we have to figure out, okay, who's in ops? You know, we have to go to the members and we have to find out who's in ops. We have to go and find out who's in the sales managers, who's in the sales group. You know, we're going to have to basically have a printout in front of us in order to make this stuff happen, which I know is not that big a deal, but it is kind of annoying. So that's why a good organizational structure that is well laid out ahead of time is really going to make your life easier as things progress and move forward. So kind of keep that in the back of your mind. Now, just so you know, what we're going to be doing is we're going to leave IT users, we're going to leave Jamie Owens in this NY users folder. Okay, we're not going to move Jamie and the IT users group because, I mean, let's face it, who's in that group? Jamie. And, well, you're already the administrator, so you don't have to put yourself in there. So there's not a lot of reason to create another IT organizational unit at this point in time. Now, you can if you want to. I mean, it's not going to hurt anything. And you can actually place a new OU on top of the IT users organizational unit if you create it specifically for the IT people. You know, but again, that's one of those things that is, you know, kind of down the line and something that we can do later on. All right, so what I need to do right now is I need to drag and drop my user accounts into the appropriate sales and ops department. And you know what? That's going to take me a little while, so I'm going to pause the video while I do this, and I'm just going to drag and drop them. I mean, you know, I'm just going to take A Childs here. Let's see where A Childs is supposed to be at. Member of ops users. Okay, so I'm going to take A Childs and put it A Childs into ops. Bam, there we go. And basically rinse and repeat until I have all of these users where they should be. So while I'm doing that, I'm going to pause the video. You go take a break, and I'll be right back. All right, so here we are again, and you see that I have simplified and rearranged stuff quite a lot, haven't I? You know, I have left Jamie Owens and IT users here because, remember, we're going to use security filtering on the IT users. I don't need to break out the new OU on it. Executive users, looks like I might have dragged and dropped a couple extra in here. Let's see. Yeah, that should have been an ops manager. Let's take C. Reagan. Let's put him back in the ops. Oops, I think I did it again, didn't I? Yep, I did. All right, let's try it again. And Jay Hartson. Let's see. Jay Hartson is a member of sales users. Okay, so I accidentally dragged a couple of users into the wrong organizational unit. Now, it's not too bad. But here's the thing, when you start moving stuff around inside of your organizational structure in Active Directory, you can really horse some stuff up. One of the things we're going to have to take a look at after we're all done and said with this is we're going to have to go back over and revisit our permissions. You know, remember all those shared folders that we were working on earlier? Yeah, we need to go back and check and see if we might need to make some alterations and make sure that those permissions are going to be okay. Because now our locations of our objects of our user accounts have changed. And so we might need to go back and revisit. So moving stuff around after it's well established can become problematic at times. But we're going to go check. We'll see if we need to go back and make any adjustments to those permissions. All right, so our organizational unit structure has been set up and applied. Let's take a look at ops. You see here we have the ops users in here, the ops groups, and sales users didn't end up in the right place. All right, that's the disadvantage of dragging and dropping, right? All right, let's take a look at sales now. All right, all of our sales users are here, sales managers and sales users groups. Okay. All right, so what we're going to do next is we need to go over to that group policy management console again, back to the GPMC that we were working with in the last video, and use security filtering to make sure that our executives group does not get the full force of that particular desktop lockdown policy we created, right? So as well as Jamie over in the IT users group. So let's go to the Start menu, Administrative Tools, and then we're going to go to Group Policy Management. And we're going to return back to where we came from just a little bit ago. All right, so here's New York users. Let's expand. Here's our new organizational units. And again, remember, we can actually block inheritance for the Executives OU. Let me show you how to do that real quick. If I click here on Executives OU, I'm going to go here to the Group Policy Inheritance tab. And you'll see here that Desktop Lockdown is currently being inherited, and it is enabled for the Executives organizational unit. And remember, that's the thing that's making Hank really mad, right? So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to right click on it. I'm going to select block inheritance. Okay? Notice this little exclamation mark. Well, when I block inheritance, look in my group policy inheritance tab now. You'll see that desktop lockdown has been pulled out, as well as the default domain policy. That guy's not there either. So that might be problems because in the default domain policy are all of our password settings. Okay? So again, block inheritance is not always going to be a really good idea. Now what I could do, even though the policy inheritance is being blocked for the default domain policy, I could still link the default domain policy back to Executives OU if I wanted to. But you know what? Block inheritance is usually one of those kind of last-ditch effort type of things, you know, and it's not something that we use on a daily basis. What we're going to do instead is do some security filtering here on this desktop lockdown item. Now see when I select it, remember this is only a link, right? Remember that our actual group policy objects live here in the group policy objects folder. Now when I select the link, I could right click it and notice here how the link is currently enabled. Okay, well if I would uncheck link enabled, that would turn off the policy for all three of these organizational units and users inside, as well as New York users. Okay, we're going to right click. We do want it enabled. Okay, we do want it to work. We do want it to apply to everybody except for a couple of folks. Okay, so with desktop lockdown, see here's our security filtering section. You'll notice here that the settings in this GPO can only apply to the following groups, users, and computers. Well, right now it's being applied to all of the authenticated users. Well, okay, that may not necessarily be the best thing. So there's a couple things that we could do. We could actually leave this alone right now, or we could remove the authenticated users. All right, we'll tell it okay. And we can add in all of the groups that we want it to actually apply to. So we could add in here sales managers. And let's add in the sales users. We'll add in the ops managers, and then also the ops users. Okay? So now our desktop lockdown policy is only applying to these four groups. So this is one way that we can make this happen. Okay? Now, if we really want to ensure that Hank and Jamie do not get this particular desktop lockdown policy applied, we can go into this delegation tab, and we're going to be adding in some additional users or our groups in here. All right. So in the delegation tab, this is where we can decide who can do what with this particular group policy. One thing we might want to think about doing is giving Jamie the ability to actually edit this group policy. Okay. Now, this delegation thing that we're looking at right here, here's what I want you to think about this as. Remember the whole permissions on the folders and files thing? Okay, that's what this is. Okay, these are their permissions for this particular group object. So you'll see here that right now Ops Managers has a read permission from security filtering, Ops Users has a read permission, Sales Managers, and Sales Users. So if I would select this guy and click on this Advanced tab down here, let's click on it here, you'll see that we'll get up a, oh look, this looks familiar, doesn't it? Yeah, it's the permissions box, okay? So in this permissions box, I can select Sales Users, and you'll see that Sales Users have the ability to do a read and also apply the group policy to that particular group. So yeah, this whole delegation thing, it's a big fancy word that means permissions, okay? And this is really where our groups come into play with group policy. But again, group policy is only applied to organizational units, right? But we can use the groups to control group policy as well. So we kind of have a little intermingling happening, and all these things are starting to work together. I think you're seeing that right now. I think you're seeing that groups and OUs and group policy, as well as permissions, are all kind of converging on each other right now. All right, so let's go ahead and let's make sure, we're going to ensure that this particular group policy is not applied to the executive. So that way Hank can still add his horse picture to his desktop, okay? So I'm going to click here on the Add button, just like I would for a permissions for a folder. And I'm going to type in here Executives. Notice I'm not typing in Executives OU, right? Because this is the Executives group. Now, what I'm going to do with the Executives group, you see that right now the default is to read this policy. I'm just going to deny all. All right? I don't want any users in this group to have anything to do whatsoever with desktop lockdown. I'm going to tell this guy, okay. It's going to give me that same security message that says, hey, you're applying a deny permission setting. This is a big deal. Are you sure you want to do this? Yes, I am. Okay. So now the executive, you see, has the custom permission. Now let's do the same thing for the IT users. Again, we're coming down here to the advanced. Don't go to the properties. Okay, because if you go to the properties, it just brings up the properties box and tells you who the members are, who it's a member of, and all that good stuff. I don't need to worry about that. So I'm going to click here on the Advanced button, and we're going to also add in the IT users, which Jamie is a part of, right? So now that Jamie's group is added in here to the permissions, we're going to ensure that the Apply Group Policy option is not set up. I'm going to go ahead and deny all for Jamie for right now. Now, eventually what I might want to do is provide Jamie with full control over this particular group policy so that he can actually go in and edit it. But for right now, I'm going to go ahead and just set it to deny. And I can always come back in here and, uncheck a few of these and, make some alterations so that Jamie gets permissions to control this particular group policy object. But, Jamie's new. Let's see how he does first. We're just going to make sure that desktop lockdown doesn't apply to him either. All right, so let's go ahead and we'll tell this guy okay. And so now IT users and executives have been exempted from the desktop lockdown policy. This is what we want to happen. Okay, so quite honestly, this is the fastest way to ensure that Hank can still put a picture of a horse on his desktop by using the security filtering and in the delegation tab. Let's go back over here to the scope. Now you'll notice here that underneath the security filtering option, you'll see that IT users and executives do not show up here. Why? Because this is a listing of the groups and users and computers that this actually applies to, not the ones that are exempted from. Okay? All right, so we have successfully at least configured this. Now we need to go over and test to see if Hank can actually do anything with his desktop. But before we do that, there's two things that we need to do first, okay? First of all, we need to make sure that we push down this updated group policy to all of our computers. So let's go to the Start menu, and let's do a CMD to bring up the command prompt. And we're going to do a group policy update /force, GP update /force. So that way, the client 2 machine that we're going to be testing this out on should receive all of these changes that we have applied to the policy for Hank. Now, one quick note about that, when you do a GP update /force, the policy will not be applied until the user logs off and logs back in. So let me do a real quick GP update space / question mark. Okay, I want to show you just a real quick mention of the help files for this one. When you do a GP update / force, you can also specify a /boot. That will actually cause the computer to restart. Okay, may not necessarily be the best idea. Most of the time, we can actually cause a log off. So we can do GP update / log off. So that way our users would have to log back on. Don't do this in the middle of the day. Okay, when a bunch of people are doing a bunch of work. You're going to make a lot of people mad if you do. Now, if it's an emergency, okay, that's one thing. This wait option here, you're probably not going to use this very often. Basically, it just sets the number of seconds to wait for policy processing to finish. This is more kind of a troubleshooting type of thing. I don't use it that often, to tell you the truth, but I do use a lot of the force options. We can also, by the way, target a specific computer or a specific user. So if you don't want to do a GP update / force to everybody in your network, which could become hazardous to your health and to your job security, then you can just target one specific computer or one specific user. Then that one specific user, or whoever happens to be on that computer at the time, would then have to log off and log back on. Or if you specified the boot option, well, then you might end up booting them off and rebooting the machine. Okay, so we don't have to worry about that, because right now, the only people at work right now are Jamie, Hank, and you. Okay, so fortunately, no one else has actually been called in just yet. So we're okay to do a GP update / force. Let's go ahead and let's close this guy out. Also, the other thing we might want to do real quick is we might want to ensure that both domain controllers are getting these settings. Because let's say that Hank's machine, for some weird reason, decides to use and authenticate against DC2. Well, tell you what, let's go ahead and let's do another quick command prompt here. And let's do a repadmin. You remember this one? Repadmin / sync all. And that way, let's see, did we get any error messages? Nope, looks like we went ahead and replicated A-OK. You know, just so we're sure, let's go ahead and let's go over to DC2 using remote desktop. I'm going to minimize this one. And here's DC2 down here. Let's go ahead and let's see if DC2 has actually got all of those settings. So I'm going to go ahead and close this one to make sure that we're refreshing everything. All right, we see here in NY users, I'm over here again on DC2. And in the NY users folder, everybody's still here. Tell you what, let's hit the F5 key and let's do a refresh. Yeah, I'm not seeing a change either. All right, so let's go ahead and let's close this out. And let's just start Server Manager back up from scratch. And let's see if that replication is taking place. If it's not, then we have a bigger problem. But we should be okay. This might take a little bit for all the changes to show up here in our Server Manager. All right, let's go back over here to our roles section, back to Active Directory Domain Services, and to Active Directory Users and Computers. We'll expand to Global Mantics, and let's take a look in the New York OU and in the NY users. Oh, there we go. Okay. Now we just needed to force it to refresh by closing and reopening it. So we know those changes took effect A-OK. Let's see if our group policy stuff also did. Here in Administrative Tools, Group Policy Management. And we'll take just a quick look. All right, here we are in the desktop lockdown policy. Okay, well, that's good. Here's our Ops Manager, Sales Users. Let's look at the Delegation tab. The IT users and the executives. Go ahead and expand this guy real quick. There we go. IT users and executives both have those custom permissions. If we check in the advanced section, I'm going to bet you $1 to a donut that everything should be A-OK after the replication. Yep, IT users, everything is denied. Executives, everything is denied. Okay, that's fantastic. This will ensure that no matter which domain controller Hank ends up authenticating against or using to log in, he's still going to get the same settings, okay? And this is a very important step. Now, just so you know, we didn't have to do the repadmin / sync all. It would eventually replicate. It might take a little while, but the repadmin / sync all and forcing the replication actually just speeds it up. Okay, so now we've got that checked. It's better to be safer than sorry, right? Let's go over to Hank's account. Let's log in with it on client 2, and let's see if everything worked okay. All right, so here we are over on client 2. Let's go ahead and do a Control-Alt-Delete to log in. And we're going to log in as Hank Richardson. And let's see if our group policy has been stripped off of his account. Now, of course, the first thing that Hank wants to do is change something on the desktop, right? So I'm going to right-click here on the desktop. Yep, looks like it's taking just a little while to load everything up. I'm going to go here to personalize, and okay, there we go. Had to suck in a little bit of air and make sure it was going to work. Let's go into the display settings. Okay, that's all right. Let's go to the desktop background. Okay, now Hank has the permissions to go ahead and put in a picture of his favorite horse. Is it here yet? Nope, looks like maybe it's on his USB stick or something, but whatever, he now has the permissions to do that. So we get to keep our job for another day. You know, good things, right? Now let's go ahead and let's log off as Hank. And you know what? Let's try out the Elbinga account. Okay? Let's see what's happening with the Elbinga account, because we know that that account, let's go ahead and switch the user here. That account should still be receiving the group policy settings. So Elbinga should not be able to apply his own desktop. And okay, good. Boy, we need to change this and see if there's a policy for that, huh? All right, so Globomantics is still being applied as the wallpaper. I'm going to right-click and go to Personalize. Let's see how we do. Okay, looks like we have the item, but I don't get to actually change my desktop. Okay, so that's good news. That's actually good news. That tells me that desktop lockdown policy is still working for Elbinga. Let's try Jamie Owens next. Okay, we know that Jamie Owens has also been exempted. So let's just do one more quick check. It's not going to take us any more time to do a quick log off and log on, right? So we'll do Control-Delete, switch user, other user, and we'll do J. Owens. And we'll log in here as him. All right, here is J. Owens' account. Let's go ahead and close this Welcome Center. Let's right-click on the desktop, go to Personalize. All right, so now Jamie now has the ability to use the desktop background. No problem there. Let's see if Jamie has access to the rest of the stuff too. Control panel. Let's see if he can actually go in and do software installation. We'll do programs here, and let's see what he actually has available. Programs and features. All right, so Jamie's account is A-OK, so that completes our test. Looks like we were pretty successful in our endeavor here. We were able to give Hank the ability to put his horse on his desktop. We have also exempted Jamie, so as an experienced IT administrator, we're going to trust that he's not going to do anything weird. We might have to think about doing another policy, though, for the executives. Okay? Now, I know this is a little bit of blasphemy, but sometimes executive users are not always the most savvy users, all right? Let's just say that. And if you've ever worked in IT, you know what I'm talking about. They wanted to just work and oftentimes click on things that they shouldn't click on. So we might want to think about going back and reapplying some new group policy for just the executives group. But that group policy object should not include the desktop wallpaper, right? All right, one more thing to check out before we leave and do some wrap up here. Let's go back and let's check out our permissions, shall we? Let's go to the computer section and let's take a look and see if we can still get to their shared folders that we had created over on Mem1. Remember all that? So let's just check, and see if our moving stuff around has restricted any of our permissions. All right, let's go into Sales Docs here. And looks like if I go into Hank's folder, Hank didn't put any shared on we didn't put any stuff on shared on Hank's folder. So what happens if I go into sales reports? All right, looks like everything's okay there. So even though we moved stuff around, looks like our permissions still work A-OK. So we don't have to go back and reapply any permissions. It's just one of those things, just check out, just in case. Okay. When you start moving stuff around in Active Directory, sometimes bad things can happen. So, but looks like we're in good shape. So let's go ahead and let's go back over to our slides now, and let's talk about what we covered. All right, so let's go ahead and let's wrap up. Let's start off with a little bit of vocabulary. First of all, remember that security filtering is using security permissions on a group policy object to determine which users or groups, and we specified groups in this round, right, in an organizational unit gets affected by a particular group policy set of settings. The ability to enforce is the property of a group policy object that breaks through block inheritance and overrides any other conflicting GPOs. Group policy inheritance is very similar to folder inheritance, right? Where users and computers actually inherit group policy settings through organizational units. All right, so after viewing this video, you should be able to rearrange your users, groups, and organizational units. You saw that was really easy. We can just drag and drop as long as we know where everybody has to go, right? You should be able to use the GPMC to apply security filtering to include and exempt groups from group policy. I showed you briefly how to block inheritance for an OU for policies. Again, it's not something you are going to generally do, but at least you know how to do it, right? You right-click on the OU and select block inheritance. Just remember that that block inheritance blocks everything from the top down, including that default domain policy. So that can become problematic sometimes and maybe give folks a little more ability than what you want them to have, okay? You should be able to use the GPMC to see what group policy objects are being inherited by an organizational unit. And last but not least, you should be able to make your boss happy by ensuring that his or her account is not locked down, but everybody else's is. In the next video, we're going to be focusing in on the computer side because we've been doing a lot of user side of group policy right now, but we haven't even touched the computer side and the preferences section. So in this next video that's coming up, we'll get into that side. So I'll see you over there.